Well, welcome everyone to the History 250 podcast, where we interview some of America's leading historians. We could not do better than to have for our inaugural interview Professor Christopher Flannery. Chris is a distinguished scholar. He did his graduate studies at Claremont and studied with the renowned late, great Harry Jaffa. Professor Jaffa wrote one of the most important books ever written about America, The Crisis of a House Divided, an interpretation of the issues in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. If you haven't read that, I strongly encourage you to do so. Chris was a longtime professor at Azusa Pacific University. He's a co-founder of the Claremont Institute, a senior fellow there, and a senior editor for the Claremont Review of Books. Chris is also the author and narrator of 139 of the best podcasts ever made, the American Story podcast. In fact, those beautiful episodes are together one of the chief inspirations for the History 250 project. If we're telling America's story one film at a time, we're doing so in imitation of Chris Flannery, who tells the same one story at a time, one beautiful episode. So it's just with great delight and a real privilege to welcome our first guest, Chris Flannery. Chris, welcome to History 250.
Thank you, Andrew. Could you just repeat all those beautiful things you just said? They were great flattery. Thank you very much for the kind words. I really appreciate it.
All well-deserved, and a great source of excitement for me today that we could get together and talk about a mutual love, history, and a second mutual love, America. And I'm at your feet trying to learn from you. I've listened to all 139 podcasts from the American Story podcast. I've shared them with hundreds and hundreds of people, and everywhere I go, I encourage teachers to share those stories with their students. And I have dozens of anecdotes where parents and teachers alike will, on the way to work or maybe on the way to drop their kids off at school, everybody in the carpool is listening to one of those podcasts, and everyone's so encouraged. They also learn a lot, and boy, what a killer good combination that is, where people are falling in love with something that's not only true, but it's beautiful and it's encouraging and visionary. So, thanks again for all your work there, and thanks for being with us today.
Oh, glad to be here, Andrew, really.
I said a lot of nice things about you. Let me say one more thing. First of all, let me explain to the audience that your academic training is in political philosophy, and of course, toward that, I'm sure you read a ton of history. As a professor, I know that you were a man of deep humane letters. That you taught all sorts of courses that a lot of us would call seminars. So you've taught the great books. You've written in your field. The American Story podcast, to my eye, marks you as one of our great popular historians. And as soon as I say the word popular, some people might say, oh, that sounds kind of second tier. Oh, no. You think about David McCullough, for example, who wins great accolades among our top-notch scholars. Gordon Wood often cites David McCullough, for example. Gordon Wood, who's one of our best scholars in the American Revolution. I think about the Ken Burns Civil War series. And I mean, frankly, I think that series has as its heart and soul the comments of Shelby Foote, who was not an academician by training, was an aspiring novelist, actually, and took up the task of writing the story of the Civil War and became one of our finest men of letters and a beautiful storyteller. And to my eye, makes the Civil War series a great series where it might have just been good enough. So along with David McCullough and Albert Marin, maybe my two favorite popular historians, is Christopher Flannery. So I'm just so glad you're here. Each of your episodes is just a brilliant gem, and it just takes a few minutes to listen to each one. And that's why, in no small measure, it's kind of a model for the History 250 project, because each of our films will be just a few minutes long, maybe about 5 minutes. The Columbus one will probably be our longest one. When the old world meets the new world, we took a little more time with that. It's a little more complicated to tell that story. So it'll be about 7 minutes, but typically it's about 5 minutes long, which is kind of in the ballpark of your stories, Chris.
Yeah.
I want to know, even though your stories are short, uh, they are flashes of great light that illuminate the past for us. And I wanted to ask, how do you achieve that level of narrative? What are the key features of a good story concerning the past, at least at the artistic fingertips of Chris Flannery?
Yeah, thank you. Uh, well, I think I might have told you before that I'm anything but methodical or systematic. So I can't give you like the 3 steps uh, to writing one of the stories, but uh, I will say that I believe my approach is commonsensical and it's sort of true and should work for anybody. First of all, you have to notice something that you think is interesting. Now, of course, to do that, you got to be reading and and read things you love in the first place. Read things you're interested in that you think are important, and so on. And without question, something will strike you that is interesting. And so, one thing I would just say is trust yourself at that moment. Pause. Don't just move on to the next thing and accumulation fact. Pause and start asking yourself, why did that capture my attention? Why did that seem pointed to me? Why did it arrest me, as they say? And then, so you'll read more, you'll learn more with that in mind. So that's the key thing. Find something you think is interesting, trust yourself, and then, yeah, find out everything you can about it. I must admit, I am very inefficient. I read reams and reams and reams and write many, many, many pages and end up with 1,000 words in 6 minutes. So, but sticking with that thing that you think is interesting and then articulating it as, not to explain why it's interesting, but to show its interest, to convey its interest to your listener or your readers. My stories are oral. That's part of the thing I was trying to do, not just to write, but to speak this thing, to tell the story. That was part of the conception. Give yourself credit. When you notice something that interests you, focus on it, stick with it, question it, learn more about it, and articulate that interest to others. That's basically, yeah, that's how the stories come about. And I say, there are a lot of pages on the floor, digitally on the floor
Yeah.
for all those stories. At that point, it's a matter of trying to, yeah, write or say no unnecessary word. Just get it, capture that thing that is interesting. And in my case, I have for the whole series one theme, which you've touched on in a way, which is love. And that is, what is it about America that makes it worthy of love? That's a very specific approach to this subject. That's essentially my guiding interest in there for reasons we can talk about if you want. And there are a million things. There's an infinite number of things. There are reasons why we shouldn't love America. There are reasons why we should be ashamed and so on, of course. But so within that theme, I would just read, of course, partly randomly, or if something, a biography or an event caught my attention, I would look into it. And yeah, give yourself credit when you notice something's interesting. Believe in yourself in that way and follow up on it.
That's such a great tip. I'm reminded in the way you describe how you approach a topic and pursue it and bring it into greater focus and then fill out the story from that great observation. I'm reminded of how Flannery O'Connor describes writing a story. She says you got to stare at something for a long, long time, and it doesn't sound very romantic. It sounds kind of tedious and lonesome in a way. But that's what a storyteller does, I suppose, is you stare at something for a long, long time, and staring, of course, means the other things like you're in your case reading lots, writing lots, writing around it, and working through the topic and uh, touching on all those kind of things. One of our greatest film directors, Terrence Malick, famous for Thin Red Line, The Tree of Life, A Hidden Life, beautiful films. I know a little of this because of one of his editors is a friend of mine, but they take hundreds of hours of film and then pare it down to a couple of hours, you know,
Yeah.
that's kind of the Chris Flannery approach to editing.
Yeah, no,
You and Terrence Malick.
I have thought that film editing must be a wonderfully interesting thing to do. I mean, it is a real art
Yeah.
to in that case, to capture visually how, how exactly does the story move visually. That's a tremendous art. So yeah, it is very like that. I will say that, I deliberately set out to, these are written, excuse me, they're spoken stories. And as you know, they're also set to music. So,
Yes.
which is kind of like a film too. So I was really quite deliberately attempting to have an effect on the heart and mind, unashamedly have an effect on the heart and mind of the listener. And so they're meant to have not just an intellectual, but you could say an emotional component. And each one basically, you mentioned the wonderful Flannery O'Connor, no relation, I'm sorry to say.
Oh.
Uh, but right, how do you find the story? And the same thing with the film editor or the director. And that's basically each one of these is that, the thing that I'm saying is captured my interest. That's the story. And then it's a matter of trying to articulate it. So again, like a film or a Flannery O'Connor story in a way that carries the impact that you want it to carry.
Yeah. For anyone who hasn't listened to the American Story podcast yet, do listen for the music. Chris and his team selected a wide range of songs, each song suitable for the particular episode. So sometimes you get hymnody, sometimes, patriotic music. Sometimes my favorites are the ones where you have kind of that smoky film noir kind of jazz, kind of floating in the back. And, it sort of adds that nice little gray, black hue to the whole story. And you go, okay, yeah, little hard-boiled edge there to the story, like film noir. Very nice stuff.
Let me tell you a little about that, if I may. I worked with a former student of mine. He's just a great guy. He's really smart. He himself is a musician. That was his major, both in college. And he's now in that business of selecting music for movies, for commercials, for whatever. And so I didn't know anything about this world, but this was his professional world. He was just stepping into it. And so he made arrangements with these music libraries, which are, to me, since I knew nothing about it, astonishing repositories of music, astonishingly organized. And he would listen to my stories, and then the music guy on a film, he would go into this vast library and he would know what he's looking for. And he would send me half a dozen or more takes and explain why this one might be the one or this one, why. And eventually working together, he became very good at anticipating what I would think would be music that would be fitting to the thing and selecting it. Anyway, it was a lot of fun doing that part of it in a world I'd not worked in at all. And so I'd listen to half a dozen versions, and Sarah, my wife, and I, we go, oh man, which one?
Yeah.
This, it's there can be many ways of making it good,
Yeah. That's
So
wonderful.
that was fun.
You mentioned a little while ago the kind of that thematic heart of the series has to do with love. I'd like to read for the listeners part of the beautiful statement that's crafted. It's just a 2-paragraph statement. I'm not going to read both paragraphs, but I'm going to read a little bit of the first one. That is, it's the about page on the website for the American Story podcast. Chris writes, from the beginning, every generation of Americans has been faced with the same question: how should we live? And toward the end of the paragraph, wrapping up the answer, he writes, the stories that are in this series are mainly about what it is that makes America beautiful, what it is that makes America good, and therefore worthy of love. Only in this light can we see clearly what it is that might make America better and more beautiful. I thought that was such a well-crafted set of lines. What's particularly striking to me is that last line, the possibility for being better. And I'm in the very beginning of the podcast today, you mentioned there are a lot of reasons not to love America. And so, I want to take those two lines and maybe have you wed them, because a typical response to American history today is to look at the most egregious failings. What comes to mind? Slavery, Trail of Tears, Japanese internment during World War II. These are really rough stories. And oftentimes, especially young students of history today, are being taught to be moralistic and to be anachronistic, which go hand in hand. That is, we're going to judge them by the forebears by today's standards, and we're going to dismiss them. We're going to condemn them because of their moral failings. But you come along and say, well, in a more nuanced fashion, a more observational and sympathetic fashion, you say, let's look at what makes America beautiful, recognizing also that there's need for more goodness, more beauty, improvement in both realms. So can you talk a little bit? Do I have that right, by the way?
Oh, yeah.
I got my finger on the strain there.
Yeah, that's just right. And there's a lot behind that. And in a way, my whole education in political philosophy, that statement began, as you read it, with all of us having to face the question of how shall we live, which means raising the question of what is good, which I think is, generically speaking, the animating question of all those stories. But more importantly, I think it's the animating interest in history, to the extent that we're not just trying to accumulate facts. As Plutarch reminds us, history can show us examples of what is great, what is good, what is miserable, what is vile, what is evil, and we can learn from that. Some years ago, when I was younger, going to college and so on, it was a time when it was sort of conventional to think that the only legitimate history is so-called scientific history that is neutral as to what is right and wrong. If you're talking about what's right and wrong or good and bad, you're not being a scientific historian, and therefore it's not legitimate. Well, that's just not true. I would say the opposite is true, that if you're not considering what is good and bad, right and wrong in the actions of men and women in the past, then you're not asking the right questions. So in America's case, for example, as you know, it has become overwhelmingly the orthodox way of approaching history is to condemn the past as something that we have overcome, so that we are now, wise and good and can look back on these evil, racist, sexist, homophobes, patriarchs, and so on of the past. That is such an overwhelming orthodoxy, and has been for a whole generation or more in our universities, that I thought a little fresh air was called for. And I took deliberately, you could say, opposite approach. But this is something that I think is critical. That is, I don't think that you can understand what is wrong about the past unless you understand what is right. Put it differently, I don't think you can understand evil. You cannot understand evil unless you understand something critical about what is good.
Mm-hmm.
And to put it another way, it's really only in the light of what is good that evil can really show itself for what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So the historian, I would say, and the philosopher for that matter, but the historian, his duty is to show people life as it really was. And I think that you can't do that, or the best way to do that is to make sure you see what was great or good, because it is really in light of that, and only in light of that, that you can really see clearly what was evil or miserable. So that's, I don't know if that's an adequate reflection, but that's my thought.
No, it's a wonderful reflection. One can look at matters of good and evil through the lens of political philosophy, through philosophy more generally, through theology, through moral philosophy. You say that in order to really grasp that distinction, however, you've got to see it. You got to see it, and you didn't put it in these words, but what comes to my mind is you've got to see it in action, as it were, like in the field of human action, which is the what we call history, among other things. So when a student can go to a great book seminar and encounter the questions that you've brought up by reading the plays of Aeschylus and Sophocles, the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides, the dialogues of Plato, the treatises on politics, both the Nicomachean Ethics and Politics Proper by Aristotle. But it's interesting that Aristotle, in all of his studies, never really worked up history as an art or a science. I'm always very curious about that. But what is it about history proper that is telling the story that resonates with us, perhaps in a way that's distinct from, or maybe adds to the resonance that we find in these other genres?
Yeah. Yeah. I used to teach with a colleague, and most of my teaching really has been great books. That's what I, teach, whether it's ancient, modern, or American, or what. So that's true. That's my teaching. And most of my stuff was in political philosophy, as you say. So that kind of stuff. And I had a colleague who was an English teacher and a writer, a great C.S. Lewis scholar and fan. And she used to say, "Oh, you and your logos, you and your logos. Mythos is gonna every time is gonna take the cake." And this is, say, the difference between, say, philosophy and narrative, she was saying.
Mhm.
And so we used to have some good conversations about that. But I think it's very clear in a way from, go back to take Homer as a wonderful example, compare him with, Plato. But narrative does appeal to human imagination, in a way more immediately, and certainly early on. You don't typically see parents sitting around with their children in their beds at night, going through syllogisms. Be very, unless you're maybe John Stuart Mill, he probably did that. But
Oh gosh.
yeah, but so you tell stories. Well, it's that is, I would say, somehow or other the natural way for human beings to begin to learn about the things they care about, things that matter, whether it's, again, in a story or narrative history. So, yeah, it's a distinction between abstract reasoning or logos and mythos, story. It always will be intrinsically more powerful, you could say, more powerful to the human heart and mind, not just to the mind, to put something in narrative. So there's obviously a relation to abstract ideas in that. And there's sort of old sayings about history as philosophy, teaching by example. I think that examples are very powerful. I mean, there's a reason why the film industry is such a wonderfully successful industry. It's like you mentioned Aeschylus and Sophocles. Small groups of people would gather with Socrates, talking through some very complex questions, in private settings here and there, but whole amphitheaters filled to go out and see Aristophanes or Euripides and Aeschylus. And
Yeah.
there's a reason for that. You mentioned the popularity. My stories are addressed, to an amphitheater, not to
Yeah.
a private seminar room.
Um, The historian Forrest MacDonald wrote in one of his works that and forgive me, I can't remember which one it was, but he said that the American founders read more history than they did political theory.
Yeah.
In saying that, it doesn't diminish the roles of John Locke and Montesquieu and others who were so formative for the American Republic. But I wanted to know what you thought about that. If that's true, what does that tell us about the founding? What does that tell us about, say, the character of the American Republic, that it's informed strongly by history?
Yeah, that's an interesting observation by McDonald, and a true one, I think. Um, well, for one thing, they were statesmen. They were practical men, and to take a non-historian, Aristotle, as you mentioned, in Aristotle's wonderful book, the Nicomachean Ethics, one of the greatest books ever written, he advises young people to listen to men of experience.
Mm.
And he would tell them, these men may not be able to tell you why they have come to the conclusions they have about this important practical question or that one, but listen to them, because their experience carries an authenticity, a legitimacy of its own. And I think in that sense, history instructs in that way. It doesn't give you precepts, but it gives you examples which can be every bit as instructive as precepts can be. And so, yeah, you'll read the founders writing about Roman history, which they knew a lot about, English history. And of course, they read Locke and Montesquieu and so on. But so they didn't, it's not that they were not influenced by such, non-historical writers, but history is the school for statesmen. If you want to make practical judgments. I mean, Aristotle was aiming to teach his students, or wanted them to learn, phronesis, practical wisdom, the highest practical moral virtue. And he rightly recommended that one of the best ways of doing that is listen to experienced people, which is another way of saying, I would say, reading history.
Mhm.
And you can see practical men and women who are very good at making the right judgments in critical situations about all kinds of things, whether it's foreign policy or domestic policy or whatever. And they may not be able to give you an abstract explanation of why that's the right thing to do. But if you're around them enough, you come to see, like say with Churchill, if we're going to be in a war, something I'd like to be with him. And his judgment has sort of vindicated his understanding.
Mm.
And yeah, so something like that, I think.
Yeah, some of our greatest statesmen have given voice to, how'd you put it? How should we live? That is, how should we live together as Americans? Lincoln comes to mind, at least to my mind, more than anyone, leading the country through our worst crisis, and speaking so beautifully and in ways that have endured. Most Americans don't rise to the level of statesmanship, and yet, for every crisis as a country we meet, normal Joes and Janes have to face them down too. And so I was wondering if you could maybe speak to that in terms of history, exemplified, if that's the right way to put it, exemplified in the common man and the common woman. One thing that comes to mind, for example, we were just in our interview today, a few days ago, we're just past Memorial Day. And I noticed on my favorite TV station, TCM, Turner Classic Movies, it was just one wonderful film after another, most of whom were about World War II. And there's just one story after another of the courage of the average American who didn't want war, would not have chosen war as a part of his life, and yet had to go to war, and did it in a way that we kind of suspect today the average American might not live up to, as we're a little worried about that love that you mentioned on your website. We're a little worried about the love that people have for our life together, and whether or not it's a life worth laying down one's life for. So what about, you spoke so eloquently about situating the statesman, as Aristotle said, the spadias Ronimus, right? The man of practical wisdom there, uh, as the exemplar of action, and which means in our terms, the exemplar of history. What about the common man, who
Yeah.
even less so, we would say, is contemplative about the things that kind of hold our whole society together?
Yeah. Those are great thoughts. Let me start with your true reflection that right now America there's some reasons why young men and women these days, of course, as well, why young men and women would hesitate to put their life on the line for their country. I mean, two obvious reasons for that, are that in World War II, in general, Americans knew, well, for the most part, they knew our cause was really noble. I mean, there wasn't much question that Adolf Hitler was a bad man doing
Yeah, yeah.
bad things in the world, as Churchill called him, that bad man, and that our cause was a great cause, and that the world depended on America more than on any other country when things came to that. So I would say that that spirit is what in a way animates my story. So that is, those common men, those millions in World War II who put their lives on the line, and many, many hundreds of thousands of them gave their lives for their country and its cause. They largely knew that they were fighting, they were putting their life on the line for something really noble. They were preserving freedom against tyranny and so on. And what I say in one or another of these stories is that countries, America and every other country, has to ask its young people, and they are always young people. Us old guys aren't much good on the battlefield. We have to ask our young people always to place their lives on the line for their country. And because that's always true, every generation, even if we're not at war, our responsibility for all the rest of us is to make sure we keep our country worthy of the sacrifices that we will always have to ask some of our fellow citizens to make. I mean, every country has problems of different sorts with this thing, but if you take World War II versus today, that's a very clear contrast. Of course, things like the Vietnam War, as you know, that was, we had many problems with that for good reasons. So
I studied history at the University of Notre Dame in the late 70s and early 80s, and it was January 1980. There was a one-credit course on the history of the Vietnam War offered by Professor Vincent DeSantis, who was a scholar of diplomatic history. And it was the first time that Notre Dame had ever offered a course on the Vietnam War. And of course, it was just a handful of years after the end of the war. And he landed the largest classroom on campus. It was the library auditorium. And although, typically, 40 or so students could sign up for the course, he allowed any student on campus who wanted to attend the lectures to do so. I kid you not, every chair in the auditorium was filled, and kids were sitting in the aisles and leaning against the back wall. They were hanging on the edge of the stage like, young people do at a rock concert. And if you looked across the room, kids were aligned with the Republican and the Democratic Party. Some kids were independent, had made up their minds at all about these things. To a man, to a woman, everyone was befuddled. Like America was 10-0, in sports terms, and Notre Dame would care about that. We were 10-0, and then we were 10-1, and we didn't really understand what the blazes happened. And you could have heard a pin drop during every lecture. Like everyone just on the edge of their seat, hungry for understanding about what had happened. The crisis had hit the country. We felt it. We didn't understand it. and it continues to ripple out today, I think.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. No,
Yeah.
I was in graduate school, 71, 2, 3, 4. The war's still going on, and it's a very active. I mean, in Claremont, California, there were bombings that maimed secretaries and so on in the protests. Not just about the Vietnam War, but about the race thing. So it was very poignant on campus. And in graduate level courses, even there were very passionate disagreements if you have to be in a course that in which that became a theme. No, that's certainly still reverberating. Talk about history and how it accumulates and
Yeah, yeah.
carries
Uh,
on.
David McCullough has a wonderful line where this was in his Jefferson lecture. He says that the stories that we tell in history are often sort of necessary to life, kind of like the stories that you tell, or that's necessary to talk about what's beautiful and lovable about America. And he says it's important that we read stories of courage uh, of others who lived their lives in times more painful and more dangerous, more critical than our own times.
Mhm.
And I've thought for some time how what a wonderful line that is. Uh, and it maybe is one we need to hang on to more than ever. So it's like we look at our own time as sort of being a crisis of a particular ilk. Like so, you and I were talking about how young people today are less invested in the life that we have. We're seeing kind of a fracturing of American society, both in its affections and its unity. So some people would say we're in the worst crisis of our time. But how do you respond? Do you think that we are in the worst crisis of our times, or we maybe what we should say is something more like, no, we're meeting our own crises, but gosh, it doesn't compare to the Civil War, or it doesn't compare to the
Yeah,
War of Independence, et
yeah.
cetera.
Well, it is true. What it is very common in our time, very common in the last 8 years or so, to say America's never been so divided. And I have to laugh. I mean, eventually you have to ask somebody to pause for just a moment and say, okay, now there was this war in which 600,000 of us butchered one another,
Yeah, yeah,
for 4 years. And so maybe their divisions were somehow uh, more challenging than the ones we're facing, which admittedly are here. And I
yeah,
think there's something to that, and it's worth reminding people of that.
yeah,
But then someone will say, and rightly, that, in Lincoln's wonderful second inaugural, he said, you know, we all we all read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and yet we're having this war. Well, in that sense, there is a sense in which our divisions are more profound today than they were in Lincoln's time. It's true, Americans were killing one another
mm,
horrifyingly in the Civil War, and we're not doing that now, thank goodness. But I think the things that divide Americans now may be more profound
mm,
uh, than the division that Americans were fighting over in the Civil War, in the sense that there are Americans today who say, who simply say, America is evil, and the other side say, well, no, actually, essentially, America is good. There are other kind of, say, even philosophical divisions that are, to put it that way, again, that Americans today don't read the same Bible and pray to the same God in the way they uh, remarkably, to a large extent, did back in 1865.
yeah.
So,
And to a remarkable extent, they knew their history. So, the the northern soldiers and the southern soldiers both claim to be fighting in the name of the principles of the founding.
yeah,
And which is a kissing cousin to the principle that we're following the God of the Bible. And so yeah, that is a remarkable circumstance. Well, as we're wrapping up our discussion today, I'm reminded of something that Roger Scruton said when he talked about what an artist does. Says it's kind of like what Flannery O'Connor says about writing and what you say about writing history, and that is he says an artist looks at something in the world, um, and then by his judgment he then begins to arrange a representation of it, and by the arrangement of material, color, texture, negative and positive space, etc., he allows us then to recreate the experience that he had of the world. So the artist and his work of art mediate between the world and the rest of us. And listening to you talk today about history and how we tell our stories of the past in such a difficult time. Number one, as you said so eloquently, well, it's always been difficult. It may be difficult in different ways, but one thing's for sure, we really need those stories. We need those stories today because the world seems distant for a lot of young people, and it shouldn't be. It's a good world, which is not to say it's without evil, without failing, and so forth. But I just want to come back again to my observation about your storytelling, your beautiful histories, and that is I'm going to put it in Scruton terms. I really love your historical episodes because they mediate for us between America's world, America's story on the one hand, and the rest of us. And we really need that. And I'm so appreciative for everything you've done as the creator of the American Story podcast. In preparation for today, I also read a number of your articles at the Claremont Review of Books, and wow, it's just the insight, the breadth of command over big fields of understanding, especially politics and history, is just so impressive. And I would encourage everyone in our audience to go to the Claremont Review of Books and read Chris's reviews, to see his careful hand in working through competing interpretations. He's always observational. He's always sympathetic. He's a great exemplar of the liberal mind, in the sense of a liberal education frees us to think free of ideology, free of unexamined opinion, but most of all, free to see what we ought to see. So, hey, for all of us, thanks, Chris, for everything you've done to date, and I can't wait to see the next fruit of your labors. And I hope we have, this is a multi-year project. So if you will, I hope you'll come back and see us, and let's talk about another topic of interest, maybe drill down to a specific event or a person in American history.
Oh, I would look forward to that very much. And by the way, all the best with this project, which is a wonderful project that you're working on now. So I look forward to the fruits of that too.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We're going to roll out our trailer in the month of June, and then we'll roll out our first films, first podcasts. We have a bank of maps, a bank of original documents. It'll be built out over the next couple of years, so everybody can come back each week, and you'll find new materials. For everybody on our mailing list, you'll receive those materials for the Kane Academy mailing list. But yeah, we're very excited about it. And again, thanks for being a major inspiration for History 250. I wish you the best, and I look forward to the next time we get together.
Great. Well, thank you, Andrew. And I do too. And all the best with that project.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening. I look forward to the next time you and I can get together again for the History 250 podcast. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you soon.